Welcome back. Well, now it is in writing. Sarasota has been deliberating a policy regarding transgender students for several years, ever since Nate Quinn, a transgender student at Pineview, fought for the right to use the men's room. Until a special task force agreed on a consensus policy, the school district said it would handle situations on a case-by-case basis. That was until today, when Superintendent Todd Bowden sent the new guidelines crafted by the task force to principals across the county. And joining us for more are Sarasota School Superintendent Todd Bowden and Elizabeth DeGinnis, the education reporter for the Sarasota Herald Tribune. So, Superintendent, thanks for joining us. Obviously, the guidelines have evolved over the last 2 years. Going into this situation, did you have a different opinion about how transgender students should be handled in terms of bathrooms and locker rooms and so forth?
You know, I certainly did. If you go back to the application process for superintendent, that's when the Nate Quinn was playing out. There were lots of questions for all the prospective candidates about how would they handle these issues. And I was a firm believer on the case-by-case basis. I was also a very strong advocate for parent notification. And so in the last year and a half, I've allowed myself to be educated on this issue, to observe the inner workings of the district. And I think we've reached a point where we have enough experience with these issues that we can set some parameters. When you look at the guidelines, they're not hard and fast, but what they do is they deliver some principles that allow us to continue to work with our students. And one of those is that the student controls the message. It's their story to tell.
Elizabeth, if you remember back to the Nate Quinn situation, there was pushback from some parents and some members of the community. Exactly, remind us what that was and where those folks have been for the last 2 years in terms of still concerned about this.
Yeah, so what's interesting is I think that initial meeting I was not actually there for, but you had a lot of people, parents, community members, even people I've heard that were not actually from the Sarasota area who came to speak to this issue and said either that they felt uncomfortable with the policy being brought forth, or that some of the things that you've heard, which are that it might make their students feel unsafe. And that's actually mentioned in these new guidelines from the district, because there is a line that I believe says that students who may feel uncomfortable with sharing a bathroom or locker room with transgender students can actually use the universal restroom, the single stall restroom, for that purpose. But what's interesting is that we've seen allies and trans students and just advocates come back to board meetings a number of times over the last 2 years, but you haven't really seen that same opposition at those meetings. All
right, so Superintendent, this task force has been going through its process. When did they conclude their work, and how long has these new proposed guidelines been sitting on your desk?
So there's been some back and forth. The last formal meeting of the task force was August a year ago. And I'll tell you, there was a process for me to reach a comfort level in issuing those guidelines. It is the work of the task force, but ultimately it goes out under the authority of the superintendent. We were closely watching a case out of St. John's that would really guide the way that schools interact with transgender students. That case was settled this summer. I think it was important for us to understand where our board was on this issue and where that support. And so getting through the elections in August and understanding who would be on our board and what they would be willing to support. And then on a very personal level, just making sure that I was comfortable that we were doing the right thing by these students.
And that brings us to the next question, because you told us before the broadcast that you knew you had a support from a majority of the school board members, but obviously Bridget Ziegler, the chair of the school board, who's going to be on in a few minutes, is not as supportive, or at least has questions specifically about whether or not the school board signed off on these new guidelines and whether they should have been allowed to.
So the guidelines are very clear that they are guidelines and they're not policy statements. The board has reaffirmed their policy on equity, and it includes the term gender. But if you look very closely at the guidelines, it goes out under the authority of the superintendent. My name appears on the document, but it does not contain the board. And I think that's very important. This is my direction. This is my guidance to staff on how to work with these students.
Okay, we have to take a quick break. Our conversation on transgender bathroom rights continues. Welcome back. We are talking about Sarasota County's new policy on transgender students, and joining us for more are Sarasota School Superintendent Todd Bowden and Elizabeth DeGinnis, the education reporter for the Sarasota Herald Tribune. Elizabeth, let me get us up to date in terms of the reaction of members of the school board to today's announcement of the guidelines.
So you kind of alluded to this earlier, but I think, again, everyone on the school board kind of disagrees with me when I say this, but there's this 3-2 divide, again, on this issue, where we have 3 school board members who are largely, I would say, or wholly in support of these guidelines, again, which Superintendent Bowden noted did not go before the board, but he consulted the board in discussing these. And then you have 2 who are not so much opposed to the idea of the guidelines, but opposed to certain parts of them. Those are the chair, Bridget Ziegler, and then Eric Robinson as well. And they basically have issues with 2 parts of it. They have issues, A, that the guidelines weren't brought before the board, and then the public wasn't given a chance to comment because of that. And then 2, they have an issue with the part of the guidelines that kind of imply that parents don't have to be involved in the process of a child coming out.
So let's take those 2 separately. We talked about the first part a little bit before, but let's talk about the parental part in terms of, have parents been cut out of this process?
And so I want to be very clear that we want parents to have a seat at the table. When a student comes forward, that's our first question is, have you had this conversation with a parent? When they say that they have not, our next question is, can we help facilitate a conversation with a parent? We want the parent at the table, but ultimately it is the student's responsibility to invite the parent in. What we cannot do is have a policy that says if a student comes forward, our first call is to the parent. That will end all communication with our students. And so we want to lead our students to a place where they feel comfortable bringing their parent in, but it has to be on their terms.
Let me ask you this question because, I read these stories and I read the public reaction to the story, and I want you just to talk to viewers right now who revert to, what their line has always been, that why should my little girl have to go to the bathroom with men?
And so, first, I think it's real important that we're talking about their peers. We're talking about students. Adults don't use the restroom with students. We have separate faculty adult restrooms on every campus. And so we're talking about the same age child. I would also tell you that our kids are ahead of the adults on this issue. That when you talk to our kids, when you look at our school board meetings and you see who comes before our school board meetings, it's not our students saying that they're feeling unsafe. It's their parents, it's people that aren't connected to our school district who say, what about, what if? It's not our students that have an outcry of saying, I feel unsafe at school. But my advice is always, talk to your child. If your child expresses any reservation at all, talk to your school administrator. We will accommodate your student. The single stall restroom is not just for transgender students. If you're uncomfortable in the restroom with a transgender student, we will allow you to use the single stall restroom. We want to make sure that we're accommodating students, but we're not doing it at the expense of other students.
All right, and let's take the first part of that question again. If Bridget Ziegler and Eric Robinson are concerned that this did not become before the board and that the public did not have the opportunity to have its input, what's your reaction to that?
I think anybody who has observed the school board over the last 2 years feels like this issue has been vetted at the board level. Their positions are very clear. It's not that they haven't been heard. Ultimately, we have 2 school board members who find themselves in the minority.
Elizabeth, what kind of repercussion might there be in terms of the actions this week?
I think, as you've noted, there have been people, I would say largely parents, that you hear from publicly, although it's hard to know with students because I don't think students always comment on the same forums that adults might in terms of their emotions about things like this. But I think that, like any decision that a body might make that other people disagree with, I think there could be feelings from parents that this is not right. I'm sure there are going to be conversations. I'm sure Superintendent Bowden has already gotten feedback from some parents who are against it. But at some point, I think when he and I had previous conversations about this is such a contentious issue that I'm not sure that, any agreement that you make on it, there's going to be somebody who's going to be opposed to it.
We only have a couple of seconds left, and obviously Bridget Ziegler will be here in a moment, but have you talked to her yet, or Eric Robinson?
Certainly. I provided the guidelines to them on Friday, then had one-on-one conversations with them throughout the day on Monday. Bridget's position with me is very clear. Those lines of communication are open.
All right, Superintendent, thank you very much
sir.
for joining us. We want to thank Superintendent Ty Bowden for joining us tonight. When we come back, Sarasota School Board Chair Bridget Ziegler will be here to discuss transgender bathroom rights along with Elizabeth DeGinnis, so stick around. Welcome back. We are talking about Sarasota County's new policy on transgender students. Joining us for more are Sarasota School Board Chair Bridget Ziegler and Elizabeth DeGinnis, the education reporter for the Sarasota Herald Tribune. So, Bridget, you heard what the superintendent had to say. Is he correct to say that the two areas that you have a difficulty with is that, number one, it should have become before the board, and number two, the issue of parental involvement?
Absolutely, but I think we need to take a couple steps back, and some of the statements I heard him say, and I've heard this thing about guidelines versus policy. Even in the opening statement, many people refer to it as policy. Everyone would consider this a policy. It's dramatically different than any practice that has taken place from a policy standpoint. And we had a task force. If you think about a task force, their role is to collect information, provide feedback, then the superintendent would review that, bring a recommendation to the board, and they vote it up and they vote it down. I mean, that is traditionally the practice. So to have it, I feel like it's a bit of semantics and to circumvent the board, regardless if there's a preconceived notion that there's a divide of 3-2 or he already has polled the board. That's just not how we work practice-wise. And I can tell you the community, and thank you to the media who has now shared this, because otherwise I don't necessarily know that they would have known, has come out and said they were disappointed, whether they support the guidelines or not. Even people on the task force have said that they were disappointed that this is how it has taken place, because it's not transparent. It doesn't afford the opportunity for people to really understand what the purpose is, what the benefits are. The board can vet the benefits and the unforeseen consequences.
Well, so what are the consequences for the superintendent right now with the board, or are you basically outvoted, or are you going to take
Well, I don't know, because we haven't actually discussed it at a board meeting, but
I would assume you pretty much know where people are at.
You know what? I think there is a good sense of where people could be, but I would hate to think in our board that it's absolutely dead set that is it. I will tell you that in the past, I've been on the board for 4 years. I was here when this first came up, and there were I was one who pushed for us to have a workshop so we could talk about it after we had a significant public comment. And in that workshop that I had pushed for months to have was a lot of different thoughts from other board members saying, oh, I never thought of that. That's the value of having this discussion.
I guess my question is this kind of academic from the point of view that, Elizabeth, you wrote in the paper that legal precedents in Florida were set this summer? In late July, a St. Johns County transgender male student won a lawsuit in federal court saying he could use the male restroom in his school. Doesn't that set the precedent in terms of that all school districts have to follow?
I mean, it certainly sets a precedent, and I think at the same time this weekend we now have the Trump administration talking about defining gender as more of a physical, biological identity. So I think it's difficult because you kind of have these mixed messages, and I know that the district has said, and Superintendent Bowden just said, a few minutes ago, that they were really waiting on that St. John's decision. But there have been other court cases too, so it's hard to say. All
right. So Bridget, talk about that federal court decision, which one would imagine, I mean, it could be appealed, but that this would require the policy of Sarasota. So
since this has all transpired, again, going back to 2016, we have all been watching. I know I've been very involved in watching all of the legal cases that have come before us. Our general counsel has been very active in keeping us updated. But again, you'll see different pockets of the community and the country choosing to go a specific way. We're a local board. We want to represent locally what our constituents believe. But all that has to take place, and we're talking more about the content of the policy. Or I say policy, but you want to call guidelines. This is more about, in my mind, the way in which it was put out there. And I think it circumvents the board. We're elected body. The superintendent, it reports to the board reports to the people. So that is fundamentally one of my biggest issues.
We have to take a quick break. We'll be back for final thoughts in a moment, so stay with us. Yeah. And let's continue our conversation on transgender bathroom rights, new policy or guidelines in Sarasota County. Bridget, the superintendent was saying that when this has been a constant discussion on the school board level, respond to his point that it's not students themselves who are going to the board saying, hold up, we're concerned about this. It's usually the adults and the parents.
So we are a school district where we have students, and the parents or guardians or families, they're the legal guardians of those children. We are required to keep them safe, and this is important to say that I believe in an environment that is free from bullying and harassment. But you can't, when we talk about stripping parents of the right of being involved, because that potentially is the most dangerous place for these students, is alarming, because think of that as a precedent with parents not being involved and having a sign-off on this. I think that's very concerning to me. Everyone I've heard from today, and that's been a lot, that's equally concerning to them. But the part that you'd asked is, we haven't had this discussion as a board in a public setting for over a year. So we have had some students that have come forward. Yes, we've had a plethora of people that came out 2 years ago. But to say that in general, I think that's a disservice to the families that are involved. They would like to make their voices heard.
The obvious question, Elizabeth, is what have other school districts around Florida done? The superintendent told us during a commercial break that a lot of the Tampa stations came down today, and he told the reporters there, we've simply modeled these guidelines after Hillsborough County.
It's true. So I think the two big examples you hear from Sarasota County would be Broward County as one example, and then Hillsborough is the other one. So Broward County, I believe, has the term gender identity in their actual policy, which means that they're distinguishing between gender and gender identity, and they're saying that it's a distinction there. And then I think also in Hillsborough they have these similar gender guidelines. So I think that other districts have been, maybe I'll say, more proactive or more clear about what they would do for transgender students or students who identify anywhere on a gender spectrum. And so I think that those are kind of the examples that are brought up.
Richard, correct me if I'm wrong, you serve on a statewide association involving school board members. What has that association done? And is this something that school board members across the state are working on to come up with a kind of a big policy idea?
So when it first really came to the forefront in Sarasota in 2016, I know I did a roundtable for board members across the state just to kind of talk through what to expect, because it's a very complicated issue. No one's denying that. And so I know on Sunday I had a conference call with our executive board to kind of talk through some other things and ask what they were doing. And you found a very similar circumstance at these particular counties, many of whom are large, was very much what Sarasota was doing. It was a case-by-case basis, really working privately with the family and the administration on how that worked, but never did a specified guideline of policy requiring one or the other. Again, I go back with just a concern of this has to be publicly discussed, and I ultimately believe the parental component has to change.
Well, hold on one second. So that's the question. It's been 2 years. You say this hasn't really been discussed for the last year. Why not?
Well, it's a great question, because the task force that was originated was as a result of a workshop that the board had done. The superintendent was the superintendent who's sitting there right now. Convened a task force. They were done in August of 2017. The appropriate thing would have been done in some of that time to bring that forward to the board and say, this is what the task force came up with. This is my recommendation. Let's move forward. There has not been a peep. I'm the chair of the board. There has been zero peep to me and myself. I can't speak to the other board members about this. There's never been brought up. So to have it provided on a Friday and say, hey, we're putting this out next week, that blindsided me, and that's also going to likely blindside the public.
Elizabeth, why now?
Well, I think this is like the question of the hour that I've heard from many people, and I think it's a good one. I think that, first of all, what the district has said is that this St. John's case was really something they were waiting for. Now, that was decided back in July, but I think that sped things up. I believe the task force, I know Bridget has said that they didn't really meet since August 2017, which the district has confirmed that as well for me. But I believe they were working on this together. And then I think also Superintendent Bowden, and he said this, had some thinking to do for himself and watching what was happening. But one of the things that the district has really stressed, and I think he's probably said this here, is that these are guidelines, but they're theoretically not a change from what's already been happening in the classroom and at schools, because principals have to deal with this when students come out at school. And so it's a way for them to have a document to refer to now, as opposed to each time going to the landings and saying, I have this situation, what should I do?
Bridget.
Sorry.
Okay.
What's next?
We have a board meeting on November 6th. I will be bringing forward a motion that would require parental consent. That is something that's a non-starter for me. It's everything that I've heard from the community that agrees with it. I think it is a dangerous place in any shape or form, and I don't know where it would stop, to have the government have a say in what's right for parents to know and what's not.
Okay, we'll have to leave the conversation there. Thank you both. Before we go, we want to share with you what some of our viewers have been saying about last night's debate between Republican Congressman Vern Buchanan and Democratic challenger David Shapiro. It was one of the most anticipated debates, and it didn't disappoint. Both Buchanan and Shapiro debated on a wide range of topics, including red tide, President Trump, tax cuts, health care, and more. Over 560 of you voted. 60% of you said that Shapiro won the debate, compared to 40% who said Buchanan won the debate. Here are some of your comments. Michael says, wish David went after Vern on issues of red tide tax cuts that afforded him a new yacht, but has not helped the middle class. He had a lot to bury Vern on, but was way too nice. Disappointed. Jacqueline says Buchanan embarrassed Shapiro. Shapiro looked rattled the entire debate. And Maureen says Shapiro was calm, focused, and on point. Buchanan was angry, bitter, and combative. Well, if you'd like to join the conversation on tonight's topic, just visit our Facebook page at facebook.com/mysuncoast. We want to thank all our guests tonight: Sarasota School Board Chair Bridget Ziegler, Superintendent Todd Bowden, and Elizabeth DeGinnis, the education reporter for the Sarasota Herald Tribune.